Well, my own career, I think, has been very unique. I started out on the staff of MIT. I went to work for IBM one summer, liked it, and stayed there 10 years, and then spent about 4.5 years at Anheuser-Bush. But the thing that was unique is that I came to IBM really as a scientist, as a technician, and I was very, very interested in measuring the market potential for data processing in a reasonably theoretical and abstract way. And after about 6 months of work in this area, the senior management at IBM became aware of what I was doing, and they recognized that this had a real value in assisting the company in doing market planning, and I became IBM's first manager of market research. And in that job, I was really a fact finder. I was gathering information and providing various key marketing executives in IBM with this information, and they would use it or not use it. Well, from market research, I became director of analytical services for IBM and functioned as IBM's chief management scientist. I was on the corporate planning staff, and we were building planning models of IBM. And that was the first time that I had ever attempted to look at a company as a whole. That is, in addition to the problems of marketing, I was interested in problems of finance and problems of production and, as I say, the company as a whole. And when I left IBM, I joined Anheuser-Bush as a corporate vice president and a member of the management committee. And for the first time in my business career, I was involved in making decisions rather than providing advice. I know at one point at IBM, I thought that the turning point in my business career was when I learned to say fascinating instead of bullshit. And this came about because I had to learn that to be a good manager, you really had to be a listener. And you learned much, much more by listening than you ever did by talking. And I remember one night I was driving home from a day at Anheuser-Bush, and when I got out of my car, I decided that we had a problem. And the first thing the following morning, I was going to discuss the problem with the corporate executive who had the decision responsibility. And I realized with a sickening feeling that I was that executive. And I think that may have been the first time I had to make a decision. And I have to say it's a lot easier to advise a decision maker than it ever is to make these decisions.
That was Dr. Robert Weinberg relating some of his experiences as a decision maker for IBM, as its first corporate manager for marketing research, and as a corporate vice president for Anheuser-Bush. Bob is now president of a St. Louis-based firm, R.S. Weinberg and Associates, which assists organizations in planning and decision-making through the use of operations research and systems analysis techniques. Bob indicated to me the usefulness of these methods in the development of alternatives as one step in the decision-making process. However, he was also frank in indicating some of their limitations and why the critical aspects of organizational decision-making involve negotiating.
Now, I think making a decision is easy if you have all the facts, and the decision is a clear decision. let me give you an example of this. A decision to make or buy is a comparatively easy decision to make. Should Anheuser-Bush have manufactured its own metal cans? That's an easy decision because the demand side is clear and it's defined, and it becomes a problem in financial analysis. What investment is required? What are the production costs? What are the savings that can be realized? And how do those savings compare to the investment? It's a very, very straightforward analysis. On the other hand, if we take a question that is far more important to any company than a decision of this sort, for example, should our company attempt to market our product outside the United States? Should our company enter a new business? Here, if you had all of the facts, you would discover, I think to your chagrin, that the final analysis depends on a series of judgments. For example, it's profitable to distribute our product in Brazil if we can be sure that inflation in Brazil is not going to continue or it's not going to grow way worse. If we can be sure that the government will not change its policies as far as multinational corporations are concerned, if we could be sure that domestic industry will not respond any differently than they've responded in the past, and a whole list of ifs. And no matter how you study a problem, I think you can't avoid ultimately making a whole string of judgments. Now, if I'm offered the option of selling my product in Brazil versus selling my product in Australia, I may well have to make the same judgments, but there are techniques for assessing the risks and assessing the likelihood of these things happening. So we might be able to say that Australia is better than Brazil, or Brazil is better than Australia, but we may be wrong completely with should we indeed market overseas, because there might be some very, very attractive alternative means. And I think that's a problem that people don't realize until they're involved in the decision-making process.
If the most critical organizational decisions become judgment calls, how do executives gain the leverage to resolve conflicting viewpoints and develop consensus on a course of action? Dr. John Kotter, a professor at the Harvard School of Business Administration, argues that effective managers know how to gain leverage through the use of power. In our interview, John describes these power dynamics and relates why executives increasingly need power to gain cooperation within their own organizations and when negotiating with other organizations, including governmental agencies and labor unions. In addition, he describes sources of leverage for developing a power base and specific methods on how to use power as leverage in organizational decision-making. Based on your research, John, what are the reasons that account for the use of power in organizations?
The typical manager, because of the very nature of his job in modern complex organizations, is made dependent upon lots of other people. The people inside the organization and other departments of the organization and outside. That's subordinates, peers, bosses, suppliers, customers, etc. That particular pattern that a manager has to cope with is really very different than the job pattern that many other professionals have, a professional scientist or an artist or something like that. Much more dependence and much more complex dependence. Now, because of that, the only rational way, if you think about it, you can cope with that kind of a job environment is by somehow gaining some countervailing power over those many people you're dependent upon. Otherwise, you are in such an incredibly vulnerable position that it's impossible to realistically assume that you could achieve your job objectives and even survive. Trying to somehow cope with the situation by relying on other people's goodwill and relying on your own capacity to kind of persuade them that they ought to help out is naive. You could spend 24 hours in a day and still not be able to talk to most of the people that a typical manager is dependent upon, much less convincingly persuade them to do what you want them to do. A lot of them don't have the time, the talent to cooperate. A lot of them don't have the incentive to cooperate. They've got their own problems. So the only realistic way to cope with that environment is to somehow set up, in a sense, a pattern of countervailing power. And with that puts a manager in a much better position to be able to control, in a sense, an environment that he doesn't have control over, to influence people to cooperate with him so he can get his particular job objectives achieved.
You mentioned a little bit about why it's difficult to persuade people to cooperate. Could you go into that a little bit further?
Sure. There are a number of reasons. First, it's not to persuade somebody to cooperate with you. At a minimum, that person has to share some objectives with you. If there's a clear conflict in objectives, the other person isn't going to be particularly interested in listening to you or cooperating at all. That tends to be the case in certain intra- and inter-organizational situations. It can be the case, maybe it's an obvious case occasionally with a union management situation, but it's more subtly the case when the other person who doesn't want to cooperate is a peer of yours and who is feeling very threatened by your own career progress and who is interested in the same next position that you're interested in and who has decided that the way to cope with that is not to help you out. And if that's where that person is at, trying to persuade him to help, well, you can blow wind around for ages, and it's just not going to help. The other problem with persuasion, besides just conflicts and goals, sometimes people just don't have the time or the talent to help out. If you're trying to convince the accounting department, all right, to get its damn reports to you on time, if they are overworked, have other pressures on them, and it just can't be done, you can list reasons from now until next month, and it's not going to have any effect. And finally, the other problem with persuasion is that it takes time. Trying to logically point out to someone why they ought to do something takes time and energy. And a manager's probably most critical resource is time, and that gets eaten away so easily. And if you had to rely on persuasion constantly, one literally would run out of hours of the day. There's no question about that.
Why doesn't formal authority work? What are some of the limitations of formal authority?
Okay, there are a number. First of all, the average manager today has what is called formal authority over a relatively limited number of his dependencies, which is to say some direct reports. The average manager today is not only dependent upon some of his employees, he's dependent upon a lot of peers that provide services in service departments. He's dependent upon not only one boss, but usually an array of bosses who have some input into his job objectives and his evaluation. He can be dependent on people outside the organization that he obviously has no formal authority over, suppliers who, if they don't come through as promised, can make his life miserable. So that's one reason. And that's getting worse, too. I think that's a critical point. Organizations today tend to be getting more complex, more specialized, and the specialization means essentially that more of the things that a manager once had control over and did himself or his immediate subordinates did are now specialized departments that he has to be dependent upon and has no formal authority over. The other problem with formal authority, even with the direct reports, let us say, is that people today clearly aren't responding to authority the way they did 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. The most obvious and visible shift occurred with the people who came out of school during the late 1960s and on up to today. They have attitudes about and feeling towards authority that are reasonably different from their parents and their grandparents. The person or the manager who tries to just order people around, as perhaps he successfully did, say during the 1950s, gets a very different response today. It doesn't work.
In your studies and as you've talked to managers, do you find them shying away from the use of power, or are they feeling comfortable with the use of power? What are their attitudes and feelings about power? I've always sensed people feeling kind of negative about it and not wanting to talk about it, even though it's there.
Highly ambivalent, no question about it. The average manager that I've talked to, at least, on the one hand, can intellectually, if you push him hard enough, see and that clearly power is important. You have to mobilize something beyond formal authority and persuasion. But on the other hand, he clearly is uncomfortable at some level too. He shares some of the negative attitudes toward power that our whole culture has. A culture that was originally created out of a rebellion against King George and power, and a culture which has traditionally valued independence. A person who kind of does it by himself and nobody bothers him and he doesn't bother anybody else, you know, kind of a low power situation. This is your frontiersman out there with a gun and the raccoon and the tree, not influencing anybody. There's something valued about that. And clearly our political processes constantly seem to remind us that power is bad. I mean, I can imagine the impact Watergate is having on this. One of the messages that comes out of that is power can be misused, it can be evil, and that's a part of all of us, managers too. And as a result, clearly I found at least managers don't necessarily want to talk about power. I have yet to see an advanced executive education program in which managers by themselves brought up and started talking about power. I've done it occasionally, and usually am met with some people who kind of nod their heads in silence with a little twinkle in their eye, some people who begin to look slightly embarrassed and shuffle papers, and not much discussion. They won't talk about it. I've even seen one case, which I was just writing about, in which a manager by himself brought up some issue relating to power and its use. And the other group of managers essentially collaborated quietly to shut him up, reprimand him, and change the subject. Fascinating. I very seldom hear the use of the word power. But nevertheless, good managers are out there using it all the time. And a lot of them do it with seeming ease. They don't seem to be hung up about it. The process per se, although the word sometimes does get in the way, does make them feel uncomfortable.
You've done some research on what are the basic sources of power in organizations. Could you give us some examples of where power is in organizations?
Sure.
How it's developed?
Managers, the primary way that managers develop power, as we normally think of it, is they develop a certain limited number of types of relationships with other people, relationships in which those others essentially are willing, under certain circumstances, to defer to the manager, which is clearly a position of power. One of those types of relationships or types of power is based upon what I would call a kind of a sense of obligation, which is the manager somehow convinces the other party or parties that they have an obligation to defer to his wishes under certain conditions. There are a number of ways that you can do this, all the way from doing favors for people with a tacit understanding that quid pro quo and all that. You know, I do a few favors for you and you have to respond. It's seldom said. I mean, you don't talk about it. That's just a cultural thing, reciprocity or something. Another way they do it is by, as a matter of fact, one of the ways that managers most effectively build on their formal authority and get it into something into some real power is by sitting down, for example, with new people or at the beginning of projects and going over with people and getting agreement on who has the legitimate authority to do what. Once that's established, then people feel obliged, if the manager wants to raise the issue, to defer to him on it. So it's relationship building around getting people obliged to defer. That's one major way. Second major way is to essentially another relationship building where people perceive that the manager has a certain expertise. Very, very important source of power, especially in today's organizations, more so, I'm sure, than a decade or two ago, where things were less complex and expertise was probably less valued. This is done most normally through visible achievement, essentially. A manager achieves something and makes sure others see that achievement so that they will conclude that indeed he has some type of expertise. Depending upon the situation, it can vary which is more important, the achievement or the visibility of it. In small situations, the achievement stands for itself. Everybody can see it. It's not a question. They can evaluate it. The more you get into large situations where people who interact with the manager interact infrequently, where they don't see tangible evidence of his achievements directly, and where maybe they're not even very well equipped to evaluate his achievements, then visibility and perceptions become the key. And good managers are smart enough, most at least that I've seen, are smart enough to take that into account and to make sure that people perceive their expertise. They don't just achieve things. They achieve things and they make damn sure that the world notices that they've achieved something. And that's a skill. That takes some time and effort, and that's a skill. A third type of power that managers develop in relationships is based on essentially the other people identifying with the manager. This is, at the extreme, this is kind of a charismatic type of power. It's usually unconscious, which is to say people aren't terribly aware that they're doing that when they kind of so identify with somebody that they're willing to essentially defer to the other person's wishes because they feel so good about this other person. But managers try to develop that type of power too through simply making themselves visible to their employees and making themselves visible in a way that they think fits kind of the idealized version that their employees have of a good leader. And also by hiring in and surrounding yourself, if you can, with people who would be more or less inclined to find you charismatic. You know, that varies. We all have slightly different visions of what a charismatic person is. It's a function of our backgrounds and our subculture and all that. And one way managers essentially gain the benefits of this identification type power is by getting the right type of people around them who would naturally do that. And again, this can evoke very, very strong responses in people. A person who's developed this kind of power among a group of employees, let us say, can very often exercise it and get the troops to do all kinds of things, great motivation, simply because of that unconscious identification. The final kind of power is what I call power based on perceived dependence. That simply means somebody out there perceives that he or she is dependent upon the manager for something, for for some type of rewards that are relevant to their lives, or simply for not doing something that would hurt them, or hurt their careers, or hurt their job progress. Now, creating perceived dependence is just a matter of identifying what people want, like, need, securing those resources yourself, and then making it clear to the other people that you have those resources and you are willing to use those resources for their benefit or harm. And that happens in a million ways all the time. I've seen supervisors, middle-level managers, use 1,000 little techniques to remind their employees every once in a while that their employees are dependent upon them for raises or promotions or whatever. Just little things to kind of remind them of that, build and reinforce that dependence-based power. A boss will call a meeting, the troops show up at the meeting on time, and he shows up late. Now, what's he doing? Well, he's just, that as they sit there twiddling their thumbs and everything, one of the things that's got to be going on in their mind is it's reminding them that the reason they're sitting here twiddling their thumbs is because he's the boss and we're dependent upon him. And if we didn't believe this, we wouldn't screw around waiting for him to show up at this meeting. We'd point out rather sharply when he shows up that he's wasted our time and we'd leave. But they don't do that. And the message that sticks in their mind is, oh yeah, We're dependent on this guy. There are other kinds of little interactions that I've seen around money and salaries that happen this way too, where a boss just subtly, in a passing in a conversation, will say something along the lines of, well, if this works out that well, I'll do everything I can to get you a raise. One of the things that does is just reminding the guy where the raise comes from, and it just reinforces that type of that relationship, which is a dependence relationship. Doesn't have to say that. Those are the four types of power that I've seen managers develop in relationships. They also, in a sense, develop the potential for power, the potential for influence by marshaling around them some other resources that can be both helpful in developing relationships and the power of relationships, and also directly helpful in influencing others. And there are a whole list of resources that are potentially relevant, all the way from budgets and office space to information and the control of information channels. Key resource in today's organizations. Information is becoming more and more a real power in and of itself. And if they're successful at that, and good managers usually are, they can then use those resources, like I say, both to build relationships and directly in influencing people through persuasion or through just exchange, buying people out.
Okay. John, you've talked about some of the sources of power, and I'd like to see if you could give us some examples of how managers use these sources of power to influence others.
Right. The typical successful manager that I've known, at least, uses a variety of methods in essentially using the power he develops to influence all those people he's dependent upon, to get the troops to cooperate, as it were. And exactly what method the manager uses tends to be a function of what type of power he has developed and the particular need he has at the time. And one of the characteristics that I've noted, at least, of successful managers is they're very good at intuitively being able to figure out, okay, given this situation and what I need from Joe over here, what's the best approach? Which of the number of methods that I could approach him with makes the most sense? And what are those alternatives? Well, if he's developed all four of those types of power in his relationship with Joe, then he's got a range there of kind of asking Joe to do it either with a hint that it's because, well, I'm an expert in that area, and therefore you should take my advice, or whether it's with a hint that Joe, you're really obliged to do this because of something that's happened in our past, or whether it's just he is assuming that Joe identifies so strongly with him that he'll just say, do it, and that fits within the definition of what Joe thinks he ought to do given his feelings about the manager, or whether he hints that it has something to do with the fact that he can reward or punish Joe, based on that dependence. So there are a variety of ways you can use those powers. The key advantage there in each case is if you've got the relationship already built, you can very often get the person to, if you choose the correct approach, it can happen very quickly. You just kind of move in and in a few sentences to Joe or whoever it is, make the request, and it can happen. At the level of kind of face-to-face influence, there are at least one or two other ways that managers go about it. The key one being persuasion, which I would define as essentially just using information to try to convince Joe that it's in his best interest to go ahead and do something. And one other, which is not used that much in organizations, although it's used a lot in the political arena outside organizations and in inter-organizational type exchanges, is to try to buy somebody out, which is to say, essentially, look, I want you to do this, and if you do, I'll give you this, which could go anywhere from money to a promise to take some action in the future or whatever. So there are a number of those methods that can be used face-to-face, and very often they're used in in combinations too. The one that I think of is that I've noticed at least is managers very often like to develop some relationship power with people, but instead of just using that, instead of just saying, Marianne, do this, or Joe, associate of mine, do this, they will say, they'll spend a few minutes to try to persuade them too. And the combination of the relationship and the fact that the person is already inclined to do whatever he's asked, in combination with a little bit of persuasion, works very nicely. It makes the person feel good, especially in a society where, as I say, with attitudes changing, people seem to like to be persuaded more than to be told. So that combination works very nicely. There are a variety of other ways that managers go about influencing people in less direct forms. The face-to-face form of influence is possibly the most common. I mean, it happens throughout a typical manager's day, but there are indirect forms, one of which I've called in the past just manipulation of somebody's environment, which is to say, instead of going right to a person and trying to, in some face-to-face form, convince him to do something or order him to do something or coerce him to do something, a manager works on the people that surround that individual and the information that's coming to that individual. He uses those face-to-face methods with others to set up a scenario that he thinks will eventually have the impact of convincing the individual to do what the manager eventually wants. It's manipulation. There's no question about it. It doesn't happen that often because it's complex to pull off, and it can be risky. Few people like to be manipulated. But it can often work when other methods fail, and it does get used. There's no question about it. And perhaps the most powerful form of influence that the managers use, and gets used the least because it's so difficult, is simply to change the structure in their whole environment, to change those forces that constantly act on the individuals they're interested in influencing. That could be all the way from changing literally a job description, to changing the structure of a performance appraisal system, to changing the players, who reports to who, to changing the statement of the division's objectives for this month. Those major kind of structural factors that have a constant and ongoing impact on people, changing them can have a big influence. Doesn't happen again that much because changing them tends to be complex and take a lot of power. The average middle manager doesn't have that power.
Can you give us some examples of this play of power or the use of power in organizations?
An almost unusual example in which coercion was used very, very effectively. Now, that was more of an inter-organizational situation in which essentially a company which had promised another organization that it would have a certain product delivered at a certain cost at a certain date was reneging essentially on its contract. And there was a meeting set up between the two companies, and the one company that had the contract was represented by its top management, a very sophisticated group. I think the key person in the meeting was the vice president of finance, and it was in their boardroom, which was this huge mahogany panel thing with a table that was 112 feet long and polished daily by scions of housekeepers. And the company that was late in producing the product, their marketing vice president showed up, and along with him, he brought this, what appeared to be just a kind of a worker. It was this guy who was about 5 feet tall, and he was dressed in factory-type clothes, sweating, and obviously the vice president of finance for the company that had called this meeting was rather surprised by this, but the marketing guy from the other company explained it simply that in trying to help them understand the situation they were in, they thought they'd bring Mr. Jones or whoever it was, who was right at the heart of the problem in their organization. And immediately the company that had called the meeting was kind of surprised and put on nerve, because there was here they are in this huge room, everybody in their three-piece suit, and this small, sweating, muscular, tanned man kind of sitting, looking scowling around the whole room at this whole scene. And as they got into the discussion, at one point the marketing guy, trying to explain the difficult situation they were in, and the finance guy on the other side came up with a big demand, essentially saying, now look, you got to cut this out. The contract's clear. Either you're going to come through in 7 days, or we're going to take you to court. And we will take you to court. You know, boom, hand on table. At which point, this little 5-foot guy stands up, scowling the whole time. The scene with the lights kind of coming down, glistening off his sweat, and all the attention of the room slides to him. And he's been fondling an ashtray, okay, this whole time. And he looks directly at the vice president of finance of the other company, and he starts talking in a very low and a very angry voice about the situation they were in and how what they were going to do about it. And as he starts building up, after about a minute of this, he takes this ashtray, which he's got in his hand, and he brings it up and slams it down on this table and puts about an inch dent in this, probably literally a $5,000 table. Okay, and the whole room kind of jumps an inch off of their seats. And the vice president of finance of the other company, just, his mouth drops down, at which point our hero, the worker, starts raving into swearing and yelling about what he and his workers would do if they didn't quit this pressure that they were putting them on. And by the time he was done, he went for about 5 minutes, and by the time he was done, the other side had clearly been impacted so emotionally, nobody was thinking. Nobody was thinking at all. They'd been completely caught by surprise by this. I'm sure in their wildest dreams they would have never thought of something like this happening. They were completely unnerved, and at which point the vice president of marketing for the company that's pulling this off stepped in and said, well, gentlemen, it seems to me that the thing we ought to do right now is A, B, C, and D. And the finance guy agreed to it. It was just a magnificent act. It was an incredible act, and it pulled it off. They pulled it off both because of either luck or skills on their part, I haven't the foggiest notion, and because it caught this other group completely by surprise. And in this case, here they created and exercised some very coercive power in a very effective manner. They got what they wanted.
What are some of the, are there any differences between the constructive or destructive use of power in organizations? As you've gone through those examples, I was playing in my mind as whether or not people see those as positives or negatives.
Well, I think people tend to see anything that rings of coercion or manipulation, certainly, as bad. I mean, culturally, at least we do. It doesn't have to be. I mean, I can find examples where I think most people, if they seriously looked at the situation, they'd see that A coerced B or A manipulated B, and yet the outcomes were such that they would say that they were good, they were valuable, they were positive. But there's no question that most people have a hang-up against the coercive and the manipulative aspect or types of power.
How can we get people to feel more comfortable with the use of power?
I personally think the key there is to help them understand the need for its use. Okay, I'm convinced that a lot of the hang-up that people have with power is that they don't have a real appreciation of why they or others are put in a position where they need to ever rely on coercion or manipulation. I would suspect that most people tend to think that happens because people are bad, you know. Kind of bad people use bad methods to satisfy evil needs or something. Now that sounds simplistic, but if you look at the way that I've heard some fairly sophisticated people talk, the implicit assumptions they're making is that very childish scenario. And if you can help people to understand that that's not necessarily what's happening, that sometimes when something is a big scenario is being manipulated onto somebody, that it's because of you're dealing with a very complex situation and other types of approaches haven't worked, and here's a manager who's trying to achieve something that we'd all agree is useful and good, and this is his only rational alternative. If you can get them to understand that, some at least of the negative connotations will go away. For example, to go back to the whole point about dependence, I'm convinced that the average person really doesn't have an appreciation for the incredibly dependent position the average manager is in. They have a naive worldview that comes from essentially the press, which is based on 1930s management techniques. There's always a huge lag by the time it gets to the people at large. That says that a manager is kind of somebody who has this formal authority and orders people around. It's all very clear cut. Responsibility equals authority, and it's simple. It's a simple world the manager operates in. That bears little relationship to the typical organization today and the life that the typical manager must cope with in that organization. And to go back to the whole issue of people's feelings about power, the word and everything. One of the things I've seen are managers who are clearly very effective at using almost all the different methods of influencing people and almost all the different ways of mobilizing power, but who, if you ask them, do you do this, X, which is one of those methods, will say no. Now that occurs if the one you've mentioned is one that sounds a bit coercive or manipulative or something like that. The curious inconsistency between what people say they do and what they really do. And I just point this out because in discussions of power among managers, I think that's something it's useful to know. For a manager himself who's trying to learn something by talking to his peers, and certainly for somebody who's trying to help a manager understand power, watch it. There can be a curious divergence between the way people behave and the way they talk when it comes to power.